Next item on our program is a panel discussion on the evolution of the crowd. We're very happy that our moderator here today is Richard Tyson, co-founder and principal at Helsinki Group. Richard is an innovation strategist, and the Helsinki Group have been crucial to us being able to pull this event together. So once again, I'd like to thank him and welcome Richard to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you again to Toby and Social Media Week, to Google for having us here, and to our panelists. And thanks again to Piers and PSFK for really interesting sort of starting point for our conversation today. What we would like to talk about today on your program is this question of the crowd, or of participation and the participant in computing at a distance on multiple platforms, and how that idea of the crowd is changing because of technology and because of the different kinds of roles both people and technologies and organizations are beginning to play in different contexts and different situations. So we've brought together a very diverse group for you. And as I call names, I'd like each person to sort of come up to the stage and take a seat. We're going to have a microphone pass around. There are not enough microphones for everyone, so we'll kind of try to work through that, just in time as we go through the panel. So, as I say, we've brought together intentionally people from different walks of life who are thinking about the crowd from different technological and different situational points of view, so that we don't get just a UN or just a disaster response view, but we get a much broader sense of how these technologies are working. So I'd like to call to the stage, first of all, John Crowley. John Crowley is a researcher at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and Star Tides. He's a specialist in disaster response, and I'd like to also bring to the stage Mark Belinsky. He's the president and founder of Digital Democracy, and they work in civic capacity. I'd also like to bring to the stage Sean Abramson. He's the founder and CEO of Mutopu. They're a social production firm. They help work with crowds in the development of products and services, using sort of more product development, using a sort of product development angle. He can tell you more about that. I'd like to bring Nadim Mahmood to the stage. He's a researcher and director and co-founder of Medic Mobile. I'd also like to bring to the stage Surya Dorabi. She's the co-founder of Food Spotting and a digital strategist with ABC News. And finally, I'd like to bring Ivan Segal to the stage, executive director for Global Voices, a leader in citizen journalism, what we want to call citizen journalism. So this is going to be quite a packed little group. I'm kind of standing here, I guess, behind everyone. Maybe the best thing to do is look around. Is there a seat? Oh, I'll sit over there. I'll talk loud. How's that? All right. Hello, everyone. How's everyone feeling? Good? All good? Excellent. Well, we'll try to keep it interesting for you. So I'm really struck by, in PSFK's report, how many of these technologies seem to be calling for and developing new kinds of behaviors. So there's this relationship between technology and behavior. So in the case of cloud phones, right? So now the phone isn't yours, the phone is could be anybody's. So this sort of brings a question to my mind, which I'd like to start out with Surya, which is, how are we seeing, or how are you beginning to see, how it is that the relationship, that emerging technologies are changing the evolution of the idea of a crowd, or how crowds are being used? How are you seeing that relationship evolve?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, you and Global Pulse. I've spent 10 years of my short-lived career working exclusively in lassoing communities online. And I've done that as a journalist for ABC, where I am now, and the New York Times, but also as a marketer for the Times and for the WashingtonPost.com prior to that. And it seems to me as though everyone uses the term crowd in a different way. Marketers think of it as lassoing communities for demographic reports. You know, who are we getting to be our next generation of fans, followers, and subscribers, so we can play defense and make sure that we're capitalizing on future potential revenue growth. And journalists think of it as crowdsourcing. You know, how can we lasso in crowds to get information in real time, and how can we identify the right sources and legitimize them and find authentic, real voices to contribute to a story. And then researchers think of crowds in a completely different way, sort of like the PSFK report we just saw, OkCupid, and data visualization analysis. How can we look back at the history of crowds to show us trends for the future so we know how to accurately predict something that might happen in the future? And I think there's no one definition of crowd. The only thing that we can say for certain is that crowds are forming more rapidly than ever before in every given sense. So, you know, we see applications, for instance, growing so rapidly that it's not uncommon for one new application on the market to have 1 million users and return visitors within a month. We saw that with Instagram last year. Prior to that, Twitter was the fastest growing application or web service on the web, but it took them 2 years to get to that point. So what we're noticing now is exponential growth in crowds, and it's only continuing to become more rapid and more instantaneous, which means as users, we're becoming accustomed to seeing rapid response, and we're becoming used to that rapid response and expecting it. Whether we're marketers or journalists or advocates, we're now expecting rapid reaction to whatever we post, which can be dangerous because I think we still have to think as journalists and authenticate our sources and really think about who it is or to whom we're speaking on all of these different vessels of communication, be it a Twitter, be it a YouTube, be it a Facebook. And as marketers, we have to think about those demographics. Who's responding to us and what's the agenda for the response? And as researchers, we should look back, despite the fact that every single day there seems to be a new fascinating application on the market. I'm fascinated by MX Share. We have to look back at the history of social media to show us what works and what doesn't work.
Thanks. John, I'd like you to maybe follow up from a sort of disaster response angle. Like, how are we beginning to see not just in, say, in the marketing or the mainstream where people are expected potentially to have, you know, well-developed infrastructure, well-developed habits around use of phones and computers, et cetera. But what about in areas that are degraded, you know, because of either disaster or because it's in an environment that's not permissive? Are we seeing changes in those technologies? Is technology proliferating as fast there? Is the use of different people on the ground and around the world there also changing as quickly as Soraya mentions in sort of the developed world?
It is changing very rapidly. I think there are a concept of a gap is really useful in a disaster. When a disaster strikes, there's usually some gap between the past and the present, what was and now what is. And people are always actively looking to try and figure out, how do I fill that in? How do I understand how things have changed? Some of that is with the situation that they're in, and some of that is actually with their own relationships. The technologies are enabling faster ability of people to understand their situation and their context. It's also enabling them to reconnect relationships and also to form new ones. Another area that's really changing very rapidly is in the gap a gap that's always existed between the large institutions and then the crowd. Or I should really, I'm not a huge fan of the term crowd because I actually don't believe that there's this perfectly mixed amorphous blob. Most of us have relationships. I think that's generally healthy. So much of the time we also, in the crowd, there's an organizational design of some kind. In disasters, this is particularly an asset that just with Haiti we began to see the ability to take advantage of. Because in Haiti, there are hometown associations. There are social organizing structures that have been on the ground that we really didn't harness very well, and we didn't harness early. That type of connection between those institutions and then the response is an entirely new area where technology will enable us to connect with local leaders, understand local needs, connect into feeds of information coming in that now need to be verified, have some other method, and then back out. I think there's one third area, and that's mapping. I cannot overstate the power of collective action and mapping and making sense of place in disasters. OpenStreetMap was by far the most successful thing in Haiti, even though it's not the thing that's in the marketing. OpenStreetMap enabled the response to happen.
So that's really interesting what you're saying, which is to say that sometimes you kind of already know the kind of crowd that when you invoke these technologies that you're going to find or you're going to use or that you expect. Other times, the use of the media itself reveals crowds and organizations you didn't even know were there in the first place. So there's both creation and discovery, happening in both, sort of on both ends. It's very interesting. So I'd like to ask Nadim. So can you tell us a little bit about, sort of in the public health area, how this idea of both discovery of crowds, but also creation of crowds just in time, is changing, say, the public health environment?
So first, just give a bit more background. So Medic Mobile is a company that I work for, and we're basically a mobile tech company. So we focus primarily in the developing world and institutions that are severely understaffed, under-resourced, clinics that don't have many doctors, don't have many nurses, midwives, very understaffed. And to fill this communication gap between patients and physicians, they've recruited these local community health workers who are basically volunteers from surrounding villages who step in and serve as an intermediary basically between physicians and patients. So they might walk from a village to a clinic to deliver a record or request medication, request emergency care. But the problem is they don't have much infrastructure, and they end up walking frequently 40, 50, 60 miles to the clinic just to deliver these records. So we place cell phones in the hands of these health workers and set up basically texting networks and record systems that allow them to communicate information in real time. So instead of walking 50 miles to tell a physician that a patient's had a seizure and fallen into a fire and can't walk, they send a text with the word emergency, state their location, state the nature of the situation, and that information is automatically forwarded to response personnel. So to get to your question about how this is changing the public health field, especially in the developing world, which is our focus, enabling real-time communication systems among these workers is invaluable. I mean, in our first pilot site alone in Malawi, there were 150 patients in 6 months that received emergency care that they otherwise wouldn't have received. And getting to John's point about location and the importance of that, if these response personnel did not have information on the location of a particular injured patient, they wouldn't be able to respond in a timely fashion. The way systems worked before these communications were in place, they would have, for example, in our pilot in Malawi, there is the emergency response personnel is a man on a motorcycle. And so he would essentially bike from village to village in a stochastic fashion on a daily basis just to see if he was needed. And that was tremendously inefficient, in addition to being very, not very thrifty with fuel. There's a huge carbon footprint associated with that, which is sort of an ancillary concern. But now he can triage messages and respond in a targeted fashion. So it's enabled care which otherwise would have been impossible, which is one thing. The second thing, kind of getting to the crowd, and the particular crowd that we deal with is these community health workers that we try and empower. And these health workers are really fairly amateur. They don't have much background in terms of medical training. And we work with diagnostic technologies. A cell phone that has been outfitted with a device that can help them perform a blood test, for example. There are technologies like this that are coming into the field. They're on the cusp of being piloted and developed. But these are health workers that aren't physicians, they're not lab technicians, but if they can be out in the field and conduct a diagnostic test at the point of care, that transforms them from this amateur actor who's just trying to help their community to one who can perform diagnostics, which is amazing. And so this idea that the technology can, and again I agree with you, John, that crowd is sort of a term that we don't like to focus on too much, partially because it's these people that we work with, their tasks can morph in such a way that the technology gives them access to generating new types of data and performing new tasks that otherwise would have been impossible. So it's hard to say exactly where this is headed, but I think it's reducing the barriers to action for a lot of different actors in the healthcare sector, such that people that don't have formal training can perform public health tasks. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that raises this other question, which I was thinking as you were talking, which is this idea of, there used to be sort of professionals and experts, doctors and patients, right? And there wasn't a whole lot of space in between those two things. So this idea of the professional and the amateur as a role gets transformed because of the kinds of things people can do. So I'd like to ask Ivan a little bit about in the world of whatever, journalism or information coming from the ground, how are you seeing this simple role between the simple transformation of a role from sort of pure expert to pure amateur and the mix of the two? How is the crowd really changing that idea?
Good morning, first of all. I think the word that we tend to use most is community or communities. I mean, when I think of crowd, I often, especially in a historical context, I think very much of anonymous behavior, often hypothetically, or I mean, it's often unthinking. That's the kind of the old school thought about it. And for us, the kind of behavior that I'm interested in is autonomous and both autonomous in terms of action, but common in terms of purpose. So whether it's a question of a public health activity or in the context of Global Voices, a community of writers and translators and authors who are collectively analyzing conversations in their communities, everybody in those spaces has a set of behaviors that is often quite complex, and they have a set of choices that they are making, which is the reason that they're participating. But it's common across a larger community. So if everybody is replicating that same behavior, even though it's complex, it gives us a set of information. And so that's kind of my approach to this question as a starter. In terms of how that changes journalism and information, a lot of that has to do with sort of the end of the foreign correspondent or the international reporter. Because in a mainstream media context, so much of what international reporting is framing a question for a relatively uninformed audience. So if I don't know much today something's happening in Burma, and I don't know much about Burma, I need the backstory before I can even really understand what's going on in terms of the news of the day. And a lot of that information, the backstory, the context, and so on and so forth, is actually already available online. And a lot of what the function of a reporter is to interpret something that occurs locally for a larger audience. And functionally, that's what it's possible to do that in more than one way, and it's possible to do that in a non-professional way, which doesn't mean that the need for reporting doesn't still exist. It does still exist, and there's certainly still a clear need for a certain set of expertise, especially around economic reporting, governance reporting. Those are tasks that your average guy walking down the street isn't going to be able to do because it takes time, it takes expertise, it takes practice. So, yeah.
So if I hear you correctly, I want to tease out one thing, which is, which is this idea of a shift from, a crowd, a mass of, let's call it potential production, to a community with a purpose, or a community with some kind of intention, built into it or around it, either because, and I think as we've heard, either a disaster response or a personal interest or a medical role. How does this? So I want to go to Sean a little bit about how does this intentionality of a group of people, of a community, how does that play out in what you've experienced in a much more sort of product development, a crowd or community production model, where there's an intention around production? How does intention work in that? And maybe say a little bit about some of the work you've done.
Yes, I think the funny thing, as we're sitting here and we're talking about crowds, and then you mentioned community, if you ask most crowdsourcing companies or have a look at the person that's responsible for sort of wrangling the crowd, their title is community manager, right? So I think that sort of says a lot. So we're using two different languages, but I think the principal reason is there's real relationships. Like, people are identifiable individually. Some have, longer tenure than others. Some are contributing more than others, but they really are, different individuals that are identifiable. In terms of the work that we've been doing, probably the most recent project that we worked on is, for me was sort of most interesting because we didn't think it was going to work, like many of the things that we start. But we worked with Graham Hill from Treehugger, and that wasn't the reason we thought it was going to work, by the way. And Graham said to us, I have this idea that today, right now, we could reduce our footprint in terms of the way that we live at home by 80%. And my challenge is I can go and create an apartment that shows that, but I feel like there may be a lot more ideas that we could get. So we set up a fairly complex brief, and then we reached out to actually very targeted communities. So we went to people like Core 77, so very, very much a design community. People at Architizer, very much architects. People on Treehugger. So we were actually working with media organizations who already had identifiable communities with specific interests and skills. And so we were trying to parse out specific roles in terms of who might be capable of responding. And so in the beginning, it was very focused on, much like you might think of an RFP, you may do an open call or you may invite very specific people. The process worked a lot like that. And then as we progressed, in terms of getting feedback, we have someone like Graham who's clearly the customer, but we were asking other people to play the role of potential customers, right? So Graham may have some very particular aesthetic taste, but if the objective is to get people to think more broadly about how they might redesign their own living spaces, we actually want them to participate and comment in the process. And so I think the main learning for us sort of more recently is that I think, to your point, you can parse out on the one end sort of professional and on the other end amateur, but I would say that I think we're finding lots of sort of hybrids in between. So people who may not think of themselves as part of the design process show up and leave really insightful and useful feedback. And then someone who's a professional designer goes back and does something with that. And so I think that's the most interesting thing, for us at the moment is just trying to actually identify people with specific skills and make sure that we can, give them something for their participation and actually get something on behalf of the organization that we're working with. So.
Super interesting. So just in this brief, and then I want to turn to Mark, we've heard that, a crowd isn't a crowd, it's a community. It has purpose. It has different roles. It's shifting those roles vis-a-vis these technologies from professional to amateur, from non-medical professional to medical semi-professional. But it also seems in what you're saying that there's also a shift in identity, in self-identity of the participant. So it's not like they decide they're an amateur journalist before they go on and do something, and then they decide they're an amateur journalist, et cetera. So there's this weird feedback loop in terms of making people be able to understand themselves differently because of what it is they do. And I wanted Mark to talk a little bit about digital democracy and this idea of how these sort of social or personal technologies of how you're seeing this change self-identity or the role of self-identity, and maybe say a little bit about what you're doing with digital democracy.
Great, thank you. So digital democracy works with grassroots organizations around the world, particularly focused on more repressive environments. And one of the things that we focus on is free and open source tools. And it's really important to us because it engenders a sense of trust. People can really take ownership over the tools. And this to us is key in the development of the community. And to us, there's a strong distinction between the crowd and the community, where crowd can really share information and it's in their interest to share, whereas crowds tend to produce noise. And then it's more about differentiating the noise to signal ratio. So in one context, we've been working in Burma, which is an extremely repressive situation, and people are sharing. Technology is starting to get into the country, and people are starting to get excited and say, okay, if people want to tune in and find out what's happening in Burma, well, we can start to tell them. And I think the trend, this global trend of people really being able to act first and then identify later is proliferating. But our danger and what we try to focus on is that can lead lead to people being killed. In repressive situations, it's very easy to start identifying people that want to report, want to contribute, want to be part of a global community, but don't necessarily understand the dangers inherent in that relationship, where they send out a tweet saying, look, I just saw a human rights abuse, and then they can be identified by the police and disappear. So for us, it's really crucial about informing people of what their relationship is to the technology and really giving a good understanding of this. And I think, as we were pointing out earlier, the differences in how marketers and reporters think about the crowds and the relationships opens up a whole Pandora's box of potential dangers that we need to be really more thoughtful of, where if Angry Birds is accessing my contact list to understand my relationship networks, that might be really great marketing information in the US that can be really dangerous in other contexts. And I think that the backlash that we've seen against closed networks like Facebook, when the privacy scandals start hitting, we're going to start seeing more of that. And I've been really excited with some of the initiative that Google has taken. They're not paying me to say that. In terms of trying to really wrangle this idea of privacy, of security, and really trying to more default in the fact that people are interested in their own privacy. They certainly want to contribute and they want to add to the greater repository of knowledge and understanding, but that doesn't mean complete openness and sharing.
So there are a lot of places to go, but just to give a quick. So we're hearing, I guess, also from Mark that it's not always good, right? So the way in which communities and the kinds of purpose that you can use a community for aren't always necessarily for the best interests of everyone. That we have this this tension in what we call crowds or participants between different kinds of intention or different kinds of purpose. And so I guess we've already kind of teased out all these different kinds of roles that communities and purposeful communities can play. Where are you seeing, and I think maybe if you could, feel free, if you're learning something from another colleague from another part, if you have a question for them, please feel free to jump in. I see you, like a lot of nodding heads going, I'd like to ask, I'd like to follow on. So just raise your hand and jump right in. I'd like to talk a little bit about how are we seeing rivalrous behaviors, right? How are one kind of Twitter crowd versus another kind of Twitter crowd, how are we seeing conflicts amongst these communities with different intent or different technologies beginning to create not just a crowd that's isolated, hey, that crowd over there, but now we're beginning to see multiple crowds. And they don't always agree, but now they have access to these technologies. In this case, sometimes the government versus people who are not the government, but then also sometimes a social media campaign by one agency and a social media campaign by another agency, and how does that begin to shape? So I'd like to tease out a little bit of the opportunity and conflict among these different kinds of things. So I'll just open it up. Anybody who wants to jump in?
That's a hint. Actually, I want to talk about Egypt a little bit, which has a direct relevance to what you're asking about, because we've seen in the Egypt context both an incredible use of technology, and Tunisia before that, to organize, but also a clear link between the online crowd, the online communities, and real crowds. And when the Egyptian government turned off the internet, the crowds didn't go away. And we saw both in the online space and in the offline space the emergence of the intention actually by the Egyptian government to form a counter crowd, a counterinsurgency crowd that then went in and physically attacked, and also online. So there was this very intentional creation of an alternative crowd force that was almost dastardly in its effect. I think that I don't know, the Egyptian result is for me, a really compelling concern, because we have people and kind of analysts that seek to instrumentalize the notion of crowd towards some future stability, and a community of people who are protesting who resolutely want to stay leaderless at the moment. Perhaps as a strategy, perhaps because they are trying to project a different vision of what it means to govern oneself, which is not embedded in an institutional construct, embedded in a construct which means I will take advantage of the citizenry. Instead, it means I will identify myself in this larger crowd as a citizen first, as a member, as a volunteer first. And the implications of that for what governance is are actually quite profound if you follow the path, that logic, all the way down. And what's scary about watching this process is that many of the governments that are observing are trying to create or insist that there has to be an interlocutor, there has to be a leader, there has to be a negotiation process that will shut down the very idea that a crowd can, or a community in this form, can actually change the way we govern ourselves. And so there's a real tension in between institutions and power and governance and people who are insisting on participation. I'm not sure how it's going to play out.
And quickly to build on that, it's really identifying audience. What I saw as a lesson in Egypt is the people organizing for democracy said, we need a community. And we have one in these social networks. We have Twitter. They're educated, they're angry, they're smart, they want to do something. The government said, we need a crowd. We're going to blast text messages through Vodafone to people and organize a rebellious crowd in the streets to fight those intellectual communities. And I just got a message an hour ago saying that the Sudanese government and police organized a fake protest in Sudan and just went in and started arresting people. And so it's going to start becoming an even more interesting conversation starting an hour ago.
I think it's pretty fascinating that America has a technological monopoly on the biggest social platforms that exist right now, and yet we're amongst the most passive culture in the way we interact on these platforms. So take the last American presidential election, for instance. I strongly believe one of John McCain's biggest faults during that election was owning up to not having an email address and to not having any sense of understanding of how to use these different platforms, whereas Obama embraced it by hiring a former Facebook co-founder, creating MyBarackObama.com, instigating one of the first crowdsourced text message campaigns to elect a U.S. president. And it seemed to me like the conversations on social platforms were very much one-sided, very much leaning left-leaning, and Twitter in this instance and Facebook in this instance became an echo chamber, at least amongst New Yorkers, of course, but also when I went home to the Midwest, which is now a red state, self-propagating, one very distinct message and a pro-Obama message, which of course I supported, but I think that what's fascinating about Egypt and about Iran 2 years earlier is that it's quite the other way around. I think that the governments are learning lessons very rapidly from these social platforms, and more conservative anti-establishment groups are using them to their advantage to, as you mentioned, counteract against intellectuals who are using them more as soapboxes. And what I would like to see is action from both parties. So if there's going to be an argument, there should always be a counter-argument, and these platforms should be enabled so that both arguments are very much vocalized either through the data visualizations like we saw earlier or historical representations of how people are communicating on both ends. Facebook is now slowly starting to open up a little bit about this data. Randy Zuckerberg of Facebook now goes on CNN and ABC and talks about how people are reacting in issues in times of crisis. But I would like to see more transparency across all the different social networks to this point.
We're really beginning to see competing crowds in disaster response humanitarian operations. Let me take a quick step back for one thing and just deal with two types of data that we normally deal with. One is sort of baseline data, understanding the map, understanding the way things generally are. The other is event data, where we're trying to characterize things that are occurring in real time. And what we're seeing is communities that are coming together with a vision of open data. Things should be open because this will make it more free. We will probably cause some conflict, but ultimately the end is good. In humanitarian operations, there's a notion of protection. you need to be a good steward for information which could cause harm if put in the wrong hands. And much of this, if we're dealing with internally displaced persons, refugees, people who are vulnerable, this data is actually very sensitive. And we're beginning to see crowds that really want to participate in the response, and they want to have access to the data, and they want to be able to provide very good services around the data. But you can't just make this stuff open. The other thing that we're beginning to see is a tension between the crowds themselves in disaster response, because humanitarian operations ultimately don't have all that much money. And all of this is motivated by the ability to get resources to do your job. So we're beginning, this could get me in a lot of trouble, so I'll step on this lightly, but there are a number of competing factions inside of the open source, open data, sort of the crowdsourcing world, disaster response, which are, you know, there should be a collaborative dynamic. There isn't always one, and it's really becoming an issue that we need to track closely and keep them all aligned on the work, which is affecting helping the affected population. It's not necessarily there right now.
Just to follow up on that, so our organization played sort of a coordination role in the 4636 project. Are most of you familiar with the 4636 project in Haiti? Just like a very brief overview. I mean, you can speak to this more than I can, John, about disaster relief. But 4636 was basically a short code that was activated in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. So amateur citizen reporters could text in with a variety of information on, you know, this building collapsed, or my uncle's been missing, or a variety of things. They could text this information into a server that would be, you know, the message would be posted to an Ushahidi server, and then that data was curated over several steps and then posted on maps, so you could visualize, you know, where resources were needed, you know, where particular events were happening in Haiti to help with resource allocation on the ground. And to get this idea, and again, I also want to be sensitive in discussing this, there were a lot of organizations that were involved in touching that data. In the hours after the earthquake, the first sort of presence on the social media side of things was on Twitter and on Facebook. People were, you know, posting messages. You know, my uncle's been missing for, you know, the past 5 hours. No one's heard anything. Like, message me back if you know. And you know, there's thousands of these messages were pouring in, and it gave a really vivid picture of sort of the landscape of what was happening in Haiti. And organizations realized very quickly that this information could be, if it was structured, it could be utilized in such a way that could really help NGOs on the ground. But a lot of organizations ended up sort of jockeying for this information, and who would be responsible for curating this data and then externalizing it. And there really was no paradigm or precedent for how this should proceed. And that was unfortunate, and so you know, things worked out in a way that I think were ultimately beneficial, but there needs to be some higher level coordination, because organizations obviously want to have high visibility, you know, during events like this, unfortunately, which is just the nature of, you know, the nonprofit or the for-profit world. Organizations want to be recognized for what they're doing, which makes perfect sense. But that can sometimes be counterproductive to the handling of the data and the externalization of the data and the expediency of the response. And so there is a tension not just between crowds, but also between organizations that manage the data coming in from those crowds that I think we should be aware of.
So I just want to catch us up a little bit on a few of the things that have been said, which are really interesting, which is that this idea of competing communities with competing interests, and sometimes competing communities with the same interest, right? You know, communities that are all trying to help, in some sense of help, but the coordination of that helping, because of either reputation or identity or data security or operational security, prevent the coordination that would actually build the bigger crowd, which creates this whole other tension about institutions, which we'll get to later. But I want to make sure we just capture those ideas and move on. Sean.
I just feel like I'm going to trivialize because I'm about to talk about like music when we're talking about people risking their lives. But I think there's some interesting lessons over the last 10 years that relate to architecture. In other words, how different communities organize and sort of what the structure is. So going back, you know, maybe 10, 12 years, if you look at open source, it was kind of interesting because there is a threshold at which people stop joining open source projects and then go off and start their own. And I think that's inevitable. There's a certain amount of motivation that may be, I'd like to be at the beginning, it's an ego thing. I think the most interesting thing for us, obviously, is what's the motivation to get involved? Is it just the solving of the problem, or is it your role in the problem? And I think open source is kind of illustrative of that, because there are lots of factions. On the music front, which is interesting, for a period of probably 4 years, spent a lot of time monitoring file sharing. Ultimately, people got cease and desist notices because of our work. I wasn't always proud of that, but it was very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is to watch the evolution of essentially a counter response every single time the music labels or the motion picture industry would try and sue people. So Napster was sort of the poster child for central control, and then Kazaa was sort of decentralized. So you'd have these super nodes that were sort of central holders, much like a DNS server, of a lot of information. And as that came under attack, and there were a lot of things happening that sort of degraded the performance of that network, eventually you get things like BitTorrent. And then you ultimately moved to networks that showed up in Japan that were onion routing, sort of very, very difficult to figure out, who's in charge. And so there really is no node anymore to take down. And I think that sort of gets to some of the leaderless structures that emerge that are very, very hard. There's a concept, an idea that holds people together. Other than that, it's really hard to figure out. So I think the architecture is, it's an interesting thing to observe, and I think that will evolve. So institutions who sort of put themselves as the center, I think often that may be a risky architecture long term. And then I guess maybe the last point, and I'm not going to go on about it too much here because it's someone else wrote a report and it's much more interesting to see what they said, is a project it's a little over a year old. It was something done by DARPA to celebrate, I think, the 40th anniversary of DARPANet, called the Network Challenge. And the test was go and find 10 red weather balloons in the US. The reason it's interesting has nothing to do with weather balloons, actually. It's that if you look at the top, let's say, 10 teams that were actually competing, so the idea was be the first team to find the location of all 10 balloons. And so what you get in the report that sort of explains the top 10 or 20 or so strategies is a really interesting look at how to organize and what the different architectures and strategies are. And among the hardest problems, I think the MIT team said, and this is the thing they talked about the least, unfortunately, was how to deal with false information, how to deal with people that are deliberately trying to undermine your process. So someone is submitting a location that's clearly false. That's easy. But then there are people who are, multiple people are showing up and corroborating a false positive, and what do you do with that? And I think that's another area that data exhaust and some of these other things are going to be very interesting, just in terms of who are these people, why are they here? And ironically, I think today it's much easier for me to figure out who someone is when I meet them by looking online to get the context. And so I think that will continue to be an issue.
Very interesting. One of the ideas that comes to mind as you were talking is that there's kind of an old idea maybe embedded in the idea of data, which is that, data is true because it's data, right? And there's this thing. And then the more people get attached to data, data becomes unreliable. It becomes something else, or potentially reliable. And so the old paradigm, almost mechanistic paradigm of we hold our data here, here is the data, now changes, because there is no data without intent. All data are theory laden, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things I'm hearing is that fact, leaderless communities with different intents and information that is reliable and or unreliable and or everything in between, depending on when and how it's used, which is also a judgment condition, creates a fog for institutions operating on the ground, and becomes a very difficult, almost plasma, that we all have to begin to negotiate in our business life, but also in the other life. So it's very interesting what you're saying. Any other quick responses? Yeah.
Just really one quick. It's almost a new kind of propaganda. in which the creation of a fog or the distraction is a power play, because the contest is over history. I mean, in the journalistic or the civic context, just to take it back to that space again, the contest is over history, right? Or you know, in the case of the music file, the music sharing, it's over ownership, it's over power. So it's about pushing forward a story and getting everybody to buy into that story. And if you can obfuscate the facts enough in a certain direction, then you can potentially win that. So it's a grand rhetorical play.
And as you're talking, it reminds us of the old distinction between soft power and hard power, right? So in a conflict, hard power would be taking down Estonia's network, by Russia, right? Brute force attack, of some kind. Soft power is creating a fog in which a leaderless community can be derailed, in some sense.
We're actually quite good at creating our own fog. In disaster response, I think one of the greatest problems, how many people are familiar with the cognitive style of PowerPoint? So what we have, telling stories is actually a really critical part of the way we make sense of change. And we have to do it. And many of the short snippets that we're using on social media are really short little bits of stories or fragments that eventually pull together a larger story. And that's critically important, but much of the ethos that we have around decision-making is around data. It's around making sense of something that we can quantify, and we can say, I think this is true because this data is, through these various methods, telling us something. Well, most of the data that we have is actually in the form of stories and an unstructured information. It's in bullet points. We have rates, we have numbers, we have all this stuff in bullet points. In PDF files that now have to be fat-fingered back into a data system. This situation for disaster response is catastrophic. It means that we actually cannot make sense of the disaster early. So the fog is ours.
And we actually see that this in the human rights context in Burma as well. Dictatorships really thrive on that kind of confusion and separation. And a lot of it is people trying to figure out what is the story, what is our shared narrative. For us, especially in this context, it was over 100 different spoken languages that are not shared. And so the data was very much about the story and visualizing that data to be able to say, wow, I didn't know what was happening across the country because I was forcibly separated from this, but also because of logistics. I didn't have that same language, didn't have that sharing. But being able to visualize this information can start to create a shared connection. To me, we saw that even in the US in 2004, where suddenly we became red states and blue states. And suddenly we had a way to discuss our political spectrum again in a new light. And so I think that finding ways to effectively harness the data into a story is really important, but also understanding people's privacies. If we get too close to the story with the mapping visualization, then we've identified the house of somebody who's reported an abuse or a place where it's occurred. But you can start to obfuscate and work with groups to understand where their trust is, to then start developing the community to tell a better story.
So to that point, one way we could do this is by marketing the concept of universal shortcodes to tourists. For a long time, I've wished for Google, and this is not my idea alone, it's actually first come up with by a strategist at Undercurrent, to create a visualization of sex tourism and issues in third world countries where there's a big problem with sex slavery. And tourists can be marketed to with the universal shortcode by texting when they see something that concerns them. And then if we were to map this back to Google, and if Google were to support this, for instance, you could see a heat map around the world of areas where there are issues of concern. So in this instance, the natural disaster isn't because of something pertaining to weather. It's a disaster that's going on right now, right in front of our eyes, but because local citizens are so accustomed to this kind of slavery, they sort of turn a blind eye, and of course there's issues of repercussion for reporting something of this nature. So I think there are a lot of different disasters in which technology can play a big part, and we have the tools in front of us already. It's just an issue of bandwidth. Who takes the onus and the responsibility of saying, okay, this is my cause, and then if we accurately represent these visualizations, through maps, then what happens then? Does it then go to the United Nations? What's the process for reporting something we then see? Just a thought.
So great segue to sort of our last question, or the last question I'd like you guys to think about and maybe share with us, which is you all have different views on different kinds of institutions, on business institutions, on informal networks, stateless peoples, disaster response, et cetera. And we've teased out this question of conflicting identities, conflicting communities, the fog of social media war. What is your advice? What would you, if you were advising the leader of an institutional organization, what must they look out for, given this changing understanding and this dynamic picture of a crowd, not just a crowd, but a participant computing participants? What must institutions be thinking about? How must they respond to this environment in order to, succeed? So maybe start with Ivan.
Well, I've had the good fortune of I've been involved in a fair number of disaster responses as well, and one of the things, mostly working with information, humanitarian information and reporting, and one of the first thing I would focus on is the structure of the hierarchies and bureaucracies of the institutions themselves, because especially the UN or governments, the classic way of managing information in that space within hierarchies is for people to hold it and to protect it. And there's a sort of an assumption that the access to the information in those hierarchies means that you have more power. The more access you have, the more power you have, and your secrecy clearance and so on and so on. And there's when confronted with the idea that there's an open data set, or there's a community of people who are just going ahead and making things and doing things, the first institutional reaction that I've seen over time, it's changing, but has been to shut down or to reject it. Rather than to kind of engage it as a question, because it's a threat to the way that those organizations and institutions have worked in the past. And I think there has been now a process where that's understood and it's articulated internally. The next question is, how do you actually reorganize or re-engineer yourself so that you can deal with that fact?
Sure. I guess there are two things that come to mind. Putting aside the sort of organizational issue for the moment, I think we've become very good at designing platforms to bring data in. We now have access to so much data. Anybody can report on data. And I think the next revolution needs to happen at the next phase, whereas curating the data, validating data, respecting the privacy of data. These are issues that sort of follow the second phase, which is once you've acquired the data, how do we look at it and make sense of it, which we sort of were touching on with the narratives and such. There's an organization called Swift River that does really interesting things. They are designing algorithms to sort through large data sets and sort of validate information based on the authority of the source and things like this. Because even with Ushahidi, everything needs to be sort of manually looked at and manually curated before it's tagged onto a map. And that's an extremely slow process, relatively speaking, considering how quickly the data is coming in. So I think the next revolution needs to happen at the phase of dealing with this data to tell a story with the data. Organizationally speaking, I've gotten really hung up just listening to the conversation on this idea of getting different organizations to handle the data coming in a structured way. In a disaster response, like I said, there wasn't much of a paradigm for dealing with things in Haiti, for example. But we need to work towards an understanding that certain organizations should be responsible for certain components. Every organization has a different way of dealing with data, and they have their own platforms for dealing with data, and they want to impose that on the situation. And I think that's counterproductive. There needs to be some sort of overarching body that organizes our efforts in a way that is coordinated. And I'm not entirely sure how that should work. But that's what I feel like needs to happen. Yeah.
So the one thing that seems interesting to me is there's no shortage of technology. So the data, some of the data issues notwithstanding, I think the hard issues are actually moving from a concept like a crowd and starting to think about the people that are working with you like employees. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but in many ways people are contributing in ways that are similar to employees. They're just not on payroll. And I think that's an important sort of starting point to think about, okay, these people are outside my organization in a relationship sense in terms of who's paying them in a lot of cases, but they're playing a role that can be as critical. And I think that smart organizations have really figured out how to set up some sort of value exchange with these people that are doing the work for them, and they get great value back in return. I think that's something that we really don't understand that well. I think that very often people say, I'm going to hire a community manager, they're going to take care of these sort of mass of people outside, and they really need much more senior attention. And then I think the other thing is just is architecture, is organizational structure. There's an example, for example, example of examples. There's Lego is a favorite example of mine because the organization's about 5,000 people, and they've figured out a way to work with an organization outside or a community outside that's about the same size as their organization. And it's hard. It's 7 years or so of sort of rebuilding the company and constantly rethinking what is the structure. And my sort of simplistic view of this is that it's a surface area problem, right? In that there's usually people start with sort of one point sticking out, and that's the access point. It's kind of like the straw that everything has to go through. And these people get completely worn out because they're doing customer service and they're doing product development and they're doing sort of editorial management, and then they're trying to direct things back into organizations. So it's a tiring role and it's kind of a thankless job very often. And so I think if you can figure out ways to have more touch points, so there's more people who can say, hey, I'm here to look out for customer service issues, or I'm here to do detection of new issues, right? So I don't have to worry about the core community and what they're doing. I'm just here to find new stuff. I think that there's just organizational design issues. So I sort of feel like the technology issues are solving themselves. There are so many smart people working on technology, but there's less focus on some of the softer stuff around incentives and org structure. So.
John, maybe you could say a little bit about this idea of an overarching structure in these sort of disaster relief environments, and what are kind of the ways in which the kinds of recommendations you would like to make in order to, I mean, do you think it's our overarching structure? Do you think it's self-organizing protocol? Is there a difference?
This is a question that I'm actually tackling on behalf of the UN, working with OCHA on defining how do we create essentially an interface between this new type of capability and the UN humanitarian system. There's some difficult questions here, and it's actually come to, there's a technical challenge that we have to literally create an API for things that are currently mostly in unstructured data format, and we have to get back into structured. That's a technical problem. It's actually something that we can scope, we can talk with engineers, we can figure this out. The hard problem is adapting the organizations to deal with essentially what's an API at another level of abstraction, where we have to have an interface between the organizations involved. Now, there is an international system for doing this through the Interagency Standing Committee at the UN. There is a process for bringing things together. It is slow. It is largely consensus-driven. There are issues that I think many people are aware of in the processes and the policies. The movement, there probably needs to be, well, there is a movement called the Common Operational Data Set on data standards. Great, okay, we have a set of data standards. But now we actually need the organizational designs to connect the whole thing together. Recommendations that I would make in the system, I have to sort of defer to the report to put into, but because there are many things where we're still in really active debate about. My own perceptions of this, and this is my own personal opinion, is separate from the research. understanding the connection points for a leader actually requires understanding what organizational design pattern do I bring to a problem. Engineers are familiar with design patterns. There are organizational design patterns. Go and look at the MIT Center for Collective Intelligence, look up the Handbook of Collective Intelligence. Huge number of patterns we can apply to different problems. We're not used to using it as a tool set. We're talking about it as this set of abstractions of things we're learning. That's something that leaders need to harness. Another thing that we actually have to look back into is probably go back to Larry Lessig's code. If people are familiar with the argument that code is law, that we have our processes, our regulations are now getting embedded in software, and that software itself is becoming something that governs the way we work. If we're going to have an API between organizations, we damn well better have the values that we think are important embedded in that API. And that's not something that I feel like our conversation has gotten to, in particular in general society. In humanitarian, I think we're actually a little bit better off because humanitarian principles are so strong, but we don't all agree. And we don't, we really don't have a good way of resolving all of those differences.
I'm going to turn to Mark, but this is the first time the word values has actually really appeared in the conversation overtly. You know, we've talked about intent and purpose and the rest of it, but this idea that an organizational API is also something that has to do with the values of the people who are doing the work is maybe something that is under-talked about or under-thought. Because it's the social media, social technology, it's 80% technology, 20% people, maybe it's 80% values in organization and 20% technology, or something like that is what I'm hearing. So, Mark, what's your advice?
You sort of took the words out of my mouth. Oh, but I wanted to say I really agree with what Sean was saying and talking about adding the value back into the community and understanding it and abstracting it from just economic value. You know, I'm no longer necessarily purchasing a worker to focus on this, but I'm contributing to a community, and ideally in kind of a fun, great way. I'm a huge fan of Legos, and I know a lot of people who are. And to a certain extent, Nadeem, I really disagree with you. I mean, I'm excited about the Swift River prospect, but I definitely agree that it's much more about the human element than the technology in an 80-20 ratio. When we were training university students for Ushahidi Haiti, the idea was, how can we compel students to actively participate and contribute to a disaster thousands of miles away and add value? And it was exciting to see that crowdsourced potential of building in a method for them to directly add information value and then connect them to translators who could do the Creole and French, English exchange for the response workers. We tried that with human rights abuse, and it's a much more slow burn issue. And so it's harder to get people committed and to develop those values and understandings in an ongoing deploy. But I think it's about engaging with the right communities to tell that story, to build up a shared responsibility, and to make people active participants and show them that it can be so much more than just Facebook, but it can impact the world in so many powerful ways. But to really help tell that story, we have to have a shared sense of the safety of individuals, the value of the individual, and ideally contributing it back. As much of that information exchange that can exist. Who are the people with the spare time right now who are not in the disaster? Well, they're going to be outside of it. But who are the people who need to be prepared the next time that's going to happen? That's inside. So can we have a big pizza party for the people who are far away doing this disaster initially, and then can we transfer that knowledge back into the, onto the ground? Because it becomes a win-win prospect for everyone.
Great, thank you. Advice?
Well, not so much advice, just, I don't know. Looking back on Haiti, it just seemed like it was one big shit show. And I think that we did a remarkable job of getting people engaged and talking about it and texting through Yele and Your Shortcut Initiative and donating more money than had been donated before. But then, you know, a week later, there were no more tag clouds, there were no more hashtags, people just forgot about it. And Haiti still exists, and the crisis is still there, and if people were digging out the rubble for the next 364 days, 24 hours a day, there would still be rubble to throw into the sea. And now we're shifting our attention to Egypt. And so my only point is I think that all of this disaster relief that we're talking about is phenomenal in the sense that we are crowd raising and we are prompting a lot of discussion and dialogue and we are at least raising the funds now, but what next? I mean, how do we sustain the engagement and get people to be active participants a year later, a year and a half later? I hope that your organizations are focusing attention on this.
There actually are a few, I think the one thing that really changed in Haiti, yeah, the crowdsource seems to be a surge capacity, and we have to also keep in mind that volunteers, in terms of amount of economic time they can devote to an emergency, is actually quite a short time horizon. It's usually around 10 to 30 days. But OpenStreetMap has been a presence on the ground, has trained over 500 Haitians in how to map their own country, has created an open data set around their location data that is now completely open and actually can be used for commercial purposes. So the capacity, I think, exists in, can we take the power of a crowd that's outside a disaster area, bring it into a space, bring a community up to speed, and then get it so that they have the capability themselves and become something that the next disaster, they're a community that's contributing to helping somewhere else.
Last thought on Haiti, that the most effective technology was actually radio. I mean, radio combined with cell phones was the most effective information technology together with, human person-to-person networks, because most of the radio stations went down. Well, Haiti's a radio culture, and a few never went down, and several came back up really quickly. So, and those are locally owned, locally operated, and embedded in their communities. And and they haven't gone anywhere. It's just, they're just, people outside aren't paying attention, and maybe that's fine, to some degree.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just sort of like a quick response. I mean, I didn't mean to downplay the importance of the narrative and in bringing people into the loop to be involved in disasters or whatever it might be, whatever the issue is. That's critically important. But sometimes, believe it or not, that's not always productive. For example, in the Haiti response, we had some volunteers that came in that got a crash course in geocoding, maybe a CS grad student, but they might not have been the most qualified individual to actually be performing that task. Some of the most qualified people were actually Haitian expatriates who had, a lot of these locations that were coming in, you couldn't find them on Google Maps. You couldn't find them by doing a search on the website. You had to go to the people who actually understood these locations, who were Haitians themselves, who had left the country, but who had actually stood at this location and truly knew where it was. So I mean, the CS grad student who, was acting for the right reasons. Like, he was actually incentivized because he wanted to do something for the social good, and that's great, and it's important to have those volunteers, but it's important to understand who the right people are for the job. It's important to target the right communities and make sure you have those people actually performing the tasks that they're qualified to do. Because that CS grad student might geocode a message that's wildly off from the actual location, whereas a Haitian expatriate can pinpoint it down to the building. So I don't mean to underplay the importance of those anecdotes and telling a story to bring people into the fold, but we shouldn't at the same time overplay that. We should be wary of the people we're bringing to the fold and make sure that we're giving them tasks that are productive. Rather than counterproductive, I guess, is my point.
Well, our time is at an end. It's right at 11 o'clock. We really wanted to give, because it was such a diverse group, we really wanted to give everyone a chance to sort of talk to each other. So we've sort of given up question time to the panel. But I wanted to ask Chris to come back up to the stage and close out. And I want to thank, again, Social Media Week, Google, the UN, PSFK, and all of our panelists for what I think was a really, really, really interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
So I would also like to reiterate our gratitude to all our panelists. This discussion has been the first part of an ongoing discussion about the ramifications of real-time and open engagement for the United Nations. Thursday, we re-engage the discussion, and I think what's been very interesting about today's panel is it's really laid the groundwork for our panels on Thursday. the first panel we're doing on Thursday is about real-time operations. We want to delve deeper into some of the operational issues involved with open engagement and real-time technologies, the dependencies and the non-dependencies involved with trying to bring real-time information into an organizational context, focused mainly around disaster response, but also other kinds of humanitarian operations. And then following that, we want to explore the ramifications of open engagement in the institutional context, which is also something we've started to hear about here today. I'm very excited about both of those discussions, and I think it's very timely for the UN to start engaging openly about some of these issues. I think one of the things we're noticing with the adoption of social media and real-time technologies is that any institution that wants to adopt these technologies has to be willing to also change itself. And so what we want to do in our discussion on Thursday is to explore how those changes are likely to manifest, what the implications are for organizations like the UN, and imagine a future where what we're actually doing in terms of engaging with the public is building capacity for the UN. What would that capacity look like? What would the UN look like if we the peoples is actually an operational part of the United Nations? So in closing, I'd like to thank Social Media Week. I'd like to thank Google for making this tremendous space available to us. I'd like to thank our partners, the UN Foundation, the Vodafone Foundation, and I feel I should say Vodafone was mentioned in the context of the Egypt text messages. But in fairness to Vodafone, they were compelled by the Egyptian government, and not the only mobile provider who was compelled through the emergency provisions laws, to disperse those messages, and they have protested fairly vociferously about that. I'd also like to thank PSFK for all their work on the future of real-time. And finally, I'd like to thank Helsinki Group for all the hard work that they've put in to make this event possible. So Thursday's event is going to be at the Paley Centre for media. Unfortunately, it's fully subscribed, but it will be available via live stream. And if you'd like to check that out, come to our website, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. And we look forward to ongoing discussions about these kinds of issues for the United Nations. Thanks very much.